Thank you for joining me today. This is the Bold Lines podcast, and I am your host, Travis Thompson. Today we're going to be talking about when the brain of the addict betrays them. There's going to be excerpts from my book, To Those Left Behind. If you want to look further into the topic today, the chapter is Therapy by Bob Newhart. If you haven't seen that Mad TV skit, I would encourage it. I think it's on a previous episode. You can find a link. So the first thing we need to do today is define what choice is. I know this part is going to be a little controversial because everybody has their own idea of choice. The first thing I want to say is that choices aren't just made in the moment. They're made over time. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I want to make the choice to be better at guitar, so I'm going to practice. In the moment, that's a great choice to make, especially if my other choices are to do nothing. Well, here's the thing. There's more than just one choice being made at the moment. If we think back, what choices would I have made up to that point? Am I making the choice out of duress, out of panic, out of boredom, out of the ignoring of other tasks that I should do? Let's also look at other choices. Is this the first time I would have practiced in a few days, a few weeks, a year? See, that choice is a little bit different over time. Let's add another choice on top of it. Let's say that maybe I just hadn't practiced guitar in a while, but maybe I have some internal sense of shame around it. Well, no longer is this an objective choice. It's also an emotional one. Our past decisions certainly influence our current decisions based on the emotions around them and not just what we decide in the moment. You see, choices are influenced over time, and they can be harder to make over time. I liken this to the whole idea of momentum is easier to maintain than acceleration. It's a lot easier to continue to do something than it is to change. Because of that, I'd like to use the same logic in terms of addiction. When a family member or a loved one comes to me and says, I'd like for them to choose to be sober. Well, the thing is there's possibly decades of choices that have led up to their current one. And I'm not entirely sure how reasonable it is to change someone's entire life on a single decision. Now, obviously, it can be made. I've seen it done, and to some degree, I've done it myself, so I get the sentiment. Can they just choose to be sober? Let's put it in context. If we've had those decades of choices over time, the choice that we would make now is drastically different. But let's put it back on the person themselves. You argue that the person should choose to be sober. How easy is it to choose to not enable them? Now, somebody might step back aghast saying, I don't enable them. Usually the person that calls me up and complains about a loved one or partner being addicted is an enabler. So before we get on a high horse and argue that addicts should just make a different choice, we should examine ourselves, and is it as easy for us to stop enabling them? Or let me rephrase, should we stop loving them the same way? I hope you heard the dripping sarcasm in this. So let me take this whole idea of choice in addiction into an analogy. I used to tell this story all the time in treatment. So it might be a little rehearsed, and maybe that's because it's a podcast, and maybe that's because I'm a therapist and I've told the story probably dozens of times. So for the addict, as they compare to someone in the general population, let's imagine that those two people are waking up in the morning and deciding what to wear. For the average person, the one who is not in the middle of addiction and isn't experiencing it themselves, it's like they come upon two shirts. The first shirt is red, and that one represents addiction. The second shirt is blue, and it represents sobriety. So they wake up in the morning and they look at the two shirts and go, Why on earth would I ever pick the red shirt? That's a terrible idea. So I pick up the blue shirt without much of a thought and move on with my day. But let's imagine that I'm in the mind of an addict. So I wake up in the morning and I see the two shirts in front of me, the red one of addiction and the blue one of recovery. Well, they start to see those shirts a little bit differently. They look at the red shirt and know that it comes with terrible consequences, that something bad will happen for sure if they pick it up. But then they look at the blue shirt of sobriety. But they don't just see a blue shirt. They see a blue shirt with a bear trap underneath it that they are 100% sure is there. So if they do pick the blue shirt, technically speaking, they could embrace sobriety, but they would lose an arm doing it. So, begrudgingly and in their own mind, somewhat logically, they'll pick the red shirt because it's safer to pick the shirt that they know the consequence of than it would be to endure the blue shirt and losing an arm. Now, if you've never been in addiction or you've never learned about it yourself, this might seem like a ridiculous analogy. I promise you, it's not. Now, is there really a bear trap under that blue shirt? Sorta. I mean, it sounds a little wild here, but the drug that could kill you is safer than the unknown invulnerability of sobriety. Again, to the general population, that seems absolutely absurd. Why would I ever use a drug that could kill me? I mean, isn't that an unknown? Well, for addicts, it's much scarier to choose sobriety because that unknown is overwhelming. At least addicts know how much they need to drink to feel a certain way. At least they know how much they should use to make the world start to go gray. Sobriety is much scarier. But how is this choice defined in our thinking, in the neural pathways that we have? A couple things to know ahead of time. Your brain wants to be efficient. It wants to create pathways where it's easy to travel again over time. Think of it like this. When was the last time you drove a car and thought through it the same way as when you were learning? At this point in your life, do you ever think through every single step, or does it become automatic? This is much the same way the brain works. I can even take this one step further into something more fundamental. Walking. When you were a baby, I have a little one right now, so I have a very recent memory of this. It took some time learning how to balance, put one foot in front of the other, and you see, walking slowly is one thing, running is a completely different one, but no longer does anybody think about it. This is your brain taking very normal, very fundamental things in life and making a pathway. These pathways are certainly made over time. I know my daughter never learned how to walk one time and then was perfect at it. It had to be redone, had to be repaved. And that's the analogy I'm going to use here in the brain. Think of it like roads. At first, when you make a connection, when your brain is able to string together a skill or an idea, it's a dirt road. Now, that dirt road does point somewhere, but it's not the easiest to travel. Over time, the brain develops those pathways. And it turns into a gravel road, and then into a paved road, and then into a superhighway. And now no longer do you think about walking. No longer do you think about the individual steps that it will take to drive. You just do it. So this is how the brain develops pathways. Now, something interesting happens. Not only are these pathways, these superhighways built, but barriers are put up to prevent change. Now, is that our brain being stubborn? To some of the people I work with, you betcha. But on most things, no. This is just how we make sense of things, because why would the brain spend excess energy considering all options when you can just walk? All right. So we've got the basic idea of how the brain works. I'm sure someone out there someday will have a degree in neuroscience and will rip this apart. I frankly don't care. It's my podcast. I'll do what I want. And I'm pretty sure I'm right. So Let's think about how this is affected by drug use. These pathways in the brain are very easily paved and are made into superhighways very quickly under levels of high emotion and trauma and drug use. But how could that be? So let's take times of unsafety or the lack of support and ability to resolve emotions. If someone goes back and thinks about the traumatic things in life, they've created, or at least their brain has created, these superhighways in their brain to where they start to look around and perceive danger before it happens. Someone who is traumatized, even outside of a clinical degree, could see something that at least resembles a bad thing that has happened before, and they'll do everything they can to prevent it. Levels of high emotion and stress do the exact same thing. When we are emotionally connected to something, we're more likely to engage in it. Let's take a kid who wants to learn how to play baseball. Great. They would like to learn the skill, but they learn more effectively when they're given emotional reinforcement and support by a parent. This is further intensified by a parent who also loves baseball. So it's not just the skill, it's the emotional involvement. And this is where drug use comes into play. Well, what do you think the brain's going to do when it's flooded with all these feel-good chemicals? Drug use hijacks this normal brain function and connects it in a very sick and twisted way into something that could kill the person. So that same use of brain development that we have for learning baseball and enjoying it because our father did is taken away and used for something that could kill us. Now, there are certain levels of permanence to all of this, especially around drug use, because someone could be listening to this and saying, "Oh, cool, Travis, it sounds like I'm screwed. My brain created superhighways, and I will only want to use drugs for the rest of my life." Okay, hopefully, I don't even know how many episodes we're in at this point. Hopefully by this point, you've come to understand that I don't find people to be terminal. So give me a little bit of grace here, and I'll see if I can help you get over the hump. There are certain levels of permanence to drug use in the brain. Some of the most obvious ones would be the age of someone. If they're older, it becomes a little bit more difficult to deal with neural pathways just because the way the brain works. The type of drug that's used also very much affects how the brain has created these highways, how long someone has used drugs, as well as the way that they had used them. Let me go to the different types of drug use for a second. The type of drug is very important. Let's take something as quote unquote, heavy quotes actually, non-threatening, as nicotine, which, goodness, nowadays, with nicotine, salt, and vaping, I'm not entirely sure is the same thing anymore, but it's certainly less severe than something like meth. It's obviously easier to come off of nicotine than it is methamphetamine, at least neurologically speaking. And that's not just because the drug is scarier or there's possible felonies involved. It's how deeply the brain responds to the drug. Also, how long you've been using a drug matters. If you've been an alcoholic for 6 months, yeah, of course that's going to be easier to come off of than the alcoholic of 20 or 30 years. Here's the other thing. How you use a drug matters. Let's take something like pain pills. It's one thing to just take them. It's another thing to crush and snort them. So when somebody says that they've been using a certain amount of a drug, yeah, I care how, because the brain's going to respond differently. All of these pathways, though, can be dealt with. It's not completely over. Look, I'll go ahead and confess here that some of these pathways are going to be permanent. In fact, for most of the people that I work with, to some degree, they still exist, those pathways. But we don't just have to get rid of pathways. It's a little bit different. We have to move around them. Because if we can't take them away, but we still have to let your brain make connections. I'd rather take an alternative route and work on it from there. So what does it look like? Well, first, we have to acknowledge that superhighways are a bad idea in addiction, but we have to know that they're there. Some ways that we can take pathways around would include coping skills or finding support groups. Most often, the things that are most helpful are pathways that exist but just haven't been used. I'd rather fix a broken down road than clear a forest to make a new one. So we re-engage with things that are important, things that bring meaning and hope for the future, like family, relationships, a sense of faith. We can go to those roads and maybe they're a little decrepit and run down, but we patch them up. We find a way to make new meaning. So great. Now we have two options, a superhighway and a little bit of an off-ramp. The choice still kind of sucks. Okay, here's the cool thing. The more you reinforce the healthy pathway and the more you deny the unhealthy one, the more likely you are to continue in a healthy path. Now that's great and all, but what if someone doesn't have those positive pathways? Or maybe they're not just a little run down. Maybe someone blew up the bridge, action movie style. Okay, you can still make pathways around. We've even seen this in things like brain damage or lobotomies. I'm so glad we don't really do lobotomies that much anymore. But look, we have the research, so we might as well talk about it. In things like lobotomies, which is removing part of the brain, we can actually see how people relearn skills that were lost due to a section of the brain being taken away. We can see how the brain can create new pathways, and the same thing is true in addiction. So we can do pathways that have made sense before. We can make new ones. But something important also has to happen. We have to put up barriers to old pathways. Look, a superhighway might always exist. It'd be better if there were barriers. Because if not, of course a superhighway sounds better than a new dirt road, especially if you have to get from point A to point B. But what are those barriers? Some of them are pretty simple. Things like loved ones, spouses, or family members refusing to communicate with you if you take that highway. That is a barrier you would have to jump and deal with in your own mind. A lot of times people will make a threat like that, and I've talked about that in a previous episode, but let's say that they mean it and they're going to hold up their end of the bargain. Someone would have to jump over a boundary of family members leaving in order to take the superhighway. That isn't necessarily taking a new path. It's just creating a barrier. You can do this with all kinds of things like hope for the future, a job, faith, a community, whatever it is. And instead of just taking that new pathway, you also look over and see all of the barriers you would have to cross. And here's the cool thing. The more barriers you put in the way, the more that you choose the healthier pathways, the more choices you would have to make in order to relapse again. And that's the really cool part of all of this, is someone one choice away from relapsing. If you are, you have not put barriers in the way. I can understand the point of view that says, I am one bad choice away from terrible things happening. I get the sentiment. It is terrible advice because you put people on the edge of having to make this same huge choice over and over and over instead of providing alternatives through family, through faith, through community support to where that blue shirt looks more appealing. That in order to see a bear trap underneath it again, you would have to put it there yourself. And that red shirt just starts to look unappealing. See, this is the difference in the choices of addiction. Those long-term decisions that were made beforehand, see, that function can be used later on as well. You can develop all of these positive choices and barriers to where the choice to relapse isn't a single one. And this is the cool thing. That choice to relapse isn't just made in a moment. It's made over 6 months or a year. And all of a sudden, relapse in sobriety isn't so terrifying. Now, can the consequences be? Yeah, obviously. But the more that I've worked with clients, especially in addiction and recovery, the more that it's become incredibly obvious that those that do relapse are the ones that started the relapse process a long time ago. They spent months breaking down barriers and boundaries. And unfortunately, due to therapists that are well-meaning but uninformed, they get to be and said, "Oh no, I just relapsed one day. What a load of garbage." It is ridiculous to tell someone in recovery, "Oh, well, you just made a bad choice." Bullcrap. There is no way that that's true. And so the choices that someone makes in early recovery are building little barriers. And over time, they should be building bigger ones. And if they're not, you need to ask why. If all someone has are flimsy foam barriers to a superhighway, yeah, obviously, they're going to relapse. But if they're concrete, if they're steel, if there's border patrol, if there's all of these other things, it's not an easy choice to relapse. You would have to bypass loved ones. You would have to look your children in the face and lie to them because now they would trust you. See, that barrier isn't just ignoring your kids or hiding it from your wife. It's intentionally eroding their trust. And now some of this may sound harsh. Again, I don't really care. It's my podcast. I'm going to say what I think the truth is because I think people need help. But the more of these barriers that you have, and the more emotionally invested you are in support of them, not out of shame, but out of true recognition, the better chance you have in long-term recovery. And if you take this in a positive way, if you really internalize all of this and say, wow, I actually have a lot of these barriers, you can still fear the consequences of relapse, but you shouldn't fear how likely relapse is unless you've pole vaulted over barriers. Now, should you take an honest account of what you've been doing? Sure. For my own life, I look in front of me and go, oh no, I've jumped over a barrier or two. Wow, I'm also really thankful there's 300 more to deal with before I would actually make a terrible decision like that. So, do I fear consequences of relapsing into old behavior? Yes. Am I afraid that tomorrow morning I'm going to screw up and lose my entire life? No. No, I'm not. And so for anybody who's listening to this episode as someone in recovery or someone who loves someone who is trying to recover, get out of the mindset that it's a single choice. Are there single hard choices that are made in the moment? Absolutely. I'm not going to discount in the slightest that sometimes we come upon hard choices. But if the only choice you have is a superhighway and a dirt road, obviously there's an easier choice. I would ask you, the listener, if you are someone in early recovery or love someone in recovery, are you making your choices easier? Is it still as difficult a year out as it was day one of recovery? If so, someone may have done you an incredible disservice by telling you that's how you're supposed to live the rest of your life. But if you've done that yourself, if you've not put the barriers in the way, that one's on you. And honestly, you're probably miserable. Take the time to create meaningful barriers, to create new pathways if they have to be, or to reinforce and rekindle these relationships that brought so much good energy and relationship to you. I hope that you listen to this and really take an account for where you are at personally and what you have to do. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got something from this podcast that could help you or someone you love. If you want more information on some of these topics, you can check out my book, To Those Left Behind. The link is going to be in the description and in some of the external links that are posted as well. I hope that if you feel the need, you can leave a tip, or if not, that you share this podcast with people around you. And also, I'm going to include a link to ask a question of the podcast. So I'm going to do an upcoming episode where I'm going to answer questions that people have. So if you have something you'd like to ask, there's going to be a link that you can click and ask it there.